I mean, you said in relation to these lockdowns and restrictions, you said, like so many of the government's measures, it's been maintained simply in order to avoid admitting that it was a mistake. And you said that politicians, quote, are destroying our economy, our cultural life and our children's education in a fit of absent-mindedness. But the trouble for people watching you here, Jonathan Sumption, is they're thinking, God, I agree with all that, but they've got away with it.
They've got away with it so far. But over time, the true costs of this, even in terms of human life, will become apparent. We are now having deaths which are nothing to do with COVID, but which have undoubtedly been accelerated by the lockdown. Deaths from dementia, deaths from untreated or undiagnosed cancer or heart disease, and from other medical conditions. So even if you limit yourself to the medical problems, the problems are accumulating and the evidence, I think, is becoming stronger.
You wrote a very interesting piece, if I might commend you, last week, but it's most disturbing as well, that the death of democracy is now a live threat. How live?
Well, we are not there yet, but there are tendencies which are really very troubling. One of them, of course, is directly related to the pandemic. It's the propensity of the population to accept highly authoritarian measures if they're sufficiently frightened, which the government's power of over the media in particular will always enable them to do. It will always be possible for governments to frighten their citizens if they try hard enough.
If we forget, though, China and Russia and Iran for a moment, is democracy being challenged by those within it?
Yes.
Who have lost faith in its own form of government?
Every time that, for example, demonstrators say, we're not going to go down the political route, not down the persuasion route in support of our grievances about, for example, climate change. We would rather bully people and make their life difficult and intolerable until they agree to submit. Every time somebody acts in that way, they are basically sidelining the political process which lies at the heart of democracy.
You write about democracy that it can only survive if it understands the values and desires of a majority of citizens. So if you go back to coronavirus, government views weren't endorsed by its citizens, but the citizens weren't given a voice.
Well, I think that the evidence is that the citizens overwhelmingly supported the lockdowns. But the problem is that they supported it under the influence of fear. And there are occasions when politicians have to take a larger view of the issues than their voters. They have to say, OK, the public may not be thinking seriously about the economic and educational fallout of all this, but we have to think about the wider issues and we have to think about future generations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You talk about, it's quite remarkable to talk to you, it's wonderful to hear these views. You talk about the respect for the rule of law central to the survival of democracy, but there is no respect for the rule of law with climate change marches, placard waving, Black Lives Matter. Are people today more unprepared to accept democratic decisions they don't like and feel a license to do as they please?
I think there is certainly a tendency to feel that the only test of, for example, the desirability of violent demonstrations is whether they yield the answer that the demonstrators want. And that goes with a reluctance to accept that the public may not be with them and that may stymie their views. I think you have to accept that you've got to persuade people. Now, I quite see that there is a problem in that it's very difficult to persuade people to tighten their belts. And pretty well all proposed solutions to climate change do involve tightening belts. And I can understand the frustration and difficulty of the climate change activists. But if you have to choose between effective action against climate change and democracy, personally, I would choose democracy. And one reason I would do that is that although it means that we may have a slower and more difficult progress towards a solution, sooner or later there will be a solution. I think that in democracies it's likely to happen only when the disaster is too imminent to be ignored.
Absolutely.
But that will happen.